Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Upcoming Developments, Funding Instruments for Hydrogen Projects. Now, let me introduce briefly our speakers for today. Two partner colleagues of mine. Christine Bader is a partner in our Hamburg office in the Regulatory, Public Law and Competition Group. Christina has well over 20 years of experience and is a regulatory expert with a specific focus on the energy sector. She advises on a wide range of regulatory and competition law topics and has in the past decade helped reshaping the German energy landscape. Britta is a partner in our energy group and joins us today from Düsseldorf. Britta has also over 15 years of experience and is an energy trading and energy sector specialist as well. Britta advises her clients on all types of energy projects with a specific focus on trading related contracts and project-related contracts. Also, Britta has helped starting clients and taking their first steps in the hydrogen sector. Please join me in thanking both of these for taking the time today. And I'm very excited that you took the time and prepared the slides to discuss this topic today. Christina, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Max. As you will all have heard, the EU is very keen on promoting a clean hydrogen economy throughout the EU. And for this purpose, they also want to provide funding. So what I'm talking about today is one of these EU instruments. The EU has set up what is called a European Hydrogen Bank. Its purpose was illustrated by the EU Commission with this little picture with two pillars. One pillar is the import of hydrogen from third countries into the EU, and the other pillar is domestic production. And what I'm talking about today relates to this domestic production pillar, namely a first auction to provide funding for clean hydrogen projects within the EEA countries. So some cornerstones of this new instrument: there will be in this first auction round a budget of a total of 800 million euros of funding that can be provided to participants. It's important that this relates to new projects, and they must have a capacity of a minimum of 5 megawatts. And it's not permitted to do a kind of virtual pooling, like presenting several small projects. These will be excluded. So what can you get out of this? There will be a fixed premium in euros per kilogram of the renewable hydrogen that will be produced over 10 years of operation. There is a maximum bid amount of 4.5 euros per kilogram. And this will not be indexed. So this needs to be taken into account in the calculations. The auction mechanism is pay as bid, and it's a static auction. So participants submit their bid once and wait for the outcome, rather than having these kind of dynamic auctions, which work a bit like eBay, where you need to update your bids until a winner has been determined. On the next slide, I would like to give an overview of how this procedure is intended to work. The procedure will be opened on 23rd of November. So how do we know already approximately how this is going to work? The EU Commission has already published a terms and conditions paper that already provides quite an amount of detail about these auctions. This is because it's not that straightforward what you have to submit. So this is for giving bidders the opportunity to prepare beforehand. When the auction is launched, there will be more paperwork published, especially certain forms that need to be used to submit the bids. And it will be very important to comply with the formal requirements. There will be one step to submit basically everything. So the financial bid amount, but also quite a bit of pre-qualification documentation. So the Commission will first review if the projects are eligible under the rules. And then for those projects that have passed the test, they will look at the bid amounts and determine the outcome. When do the bids need to be submitted? It's currently expected that this will be in early February. So not too much time to really prepare. And as said, the award will be based on price. So the qualification criteria that need to be shown will be a kind of pass or fail test, and not a ranking by quality of project. But nevertheless, for these pass or fail tests, it will be important to take care to submit everything that is expected, and I will come to that in more detail in a minute. Then one more point, if there are identical bid prices submitted, it's not a lottery, but there will be additional criteria for ranking that will apply. So the smaller the maximum grant requirement, which is calculated from the bid price and the expected volume of hydrogen to be produced, the smaller maximum amount will be ranked higher. And then if still there's equal rankings, it will be relevant if the participant comes from a country where fewer funds have previously been awarded under the EU Innovation Fund. And if then still no winner has been decided, then it's important which project will have the shorter time until entry into operation. Can I get the next slide, please? To give some more information on the details that are already set out in the terms of conditions. What the auction is about is green hydrogen, which is called RFNBO, which stands for Renewable Liquid and Gaseous Transport Fuels of Non-Biological Origin. So much easier to say green hydrogen. But this needs to comply with the relevant regulations issued by the EU, especially the delegated acts under the Renewable Energy Directive. Green energy needs to be produced from renewable energy sources and must achieve at least 70% emission savings. This sounds easy, but it's not. So it's really important to look at the detailed requirements, how this works with renewable energy sources, what will be recognized, and also the calculations regarding the greenhouse gas emission savings are set out in detail in these delegated acts. And so for anyone considering participating, it will be important to look at this closely. As this is a kind of aid, the general requirements that you will have come across in other state aid cases will also apply to this auction. So an important point is this must be new production capacity, which means that no start of works may have occurred, which means that it's not the intention to give subsidies to projects which would have been done anyway. And so you need to be in an early stage. On the other hand, as we will see in a moment, these projects will already need to have achieved a certain stage that shows that there's a realistic hope that these will already be realized. So it's important that the project is in the right stage to be able to participate in this auction. Then, of course, there will be the usual checks on beneficiaries. They may not fall under any prohibition on when companies cannot receive subsidies. And another important point is that there are certain rules on which other subsidies can or especially cannot be combined with payments under this auction. The Commission there looks at the project or the hydrogen producer. It also looks at where the renewable energy to produce the hydrogen comes from and the hydrogen off-takers. So it's not possible to get other subsidies for the producer's CapEx or OpEx. And for the renewable electricity, it depends on when the project is expected to enter into operation. If that is after 1st January 2028, then also the renewable energy cannot be subsidized. And the off-takers cannot benefit from any aid that covers additional costs of procuring green hydrogen. So this is also something to be considered when looking at the overall project setup to see whether or not it would qualify for this auction. In an FAQ document published by the Commission already, someone has asked regarding exemptions from grid fees that might apply in the context of production of green hydrogen. And the Commission has explained that the projects cannot use such exemption from grid fees if it wants to obtain funding under this auction. And as already mentioned, as always in such auction procedures, it will be important to comply with the requirements on what to submit on which forms, and especially the deadline, of course. On the next slide, as promised, I will give a bit more detail on the documentation, the requirements that need to be submitted for the pre-qualification. And it's the intention to evaluate each criterion on a pass or fail basis. So all of this needs to be met in order for the project to be admitted and for then actually looking at the price that the bidder has offered. The first point is the project needs to show its electricity sourcing strategy. That means the project must explain where the electricity is supposed to be coming from. And also the project must have taken initial steps to actually secure the electricity supply, which means a kind of pre-contract must be submitted. This can be in a memorandum of understanding, letter of intent, or something similar. And as that, as it's not permitted to already have a start of work for this step, and also especially for electrolyzer procurement, etc., it's important that it's really only pre-contracts and not yet the actual binding order. For the electricity, it will be important to show that the volume and time profile matches the volumes of hydrogen that shall be produced. And it's also expected that the LOI or other pre-contract already includes information on the pricing structure. So the Commission really wants to see that you have already looked at the project and done the calculations and decided on the setup. One question with these things is, what is if the electricity will be produced by the same entity by means of their own renewable energy plants? That's possible. In that case, you don't need an LOI. You need a letter signed by a director or senior executive that gives the same information that would be requested in the LOI. In addition to the input, so to say, also the offtake must already be shown. There are similar requirements. It's required to provide a LOI with an off-taker, which must be in line with the expected production. And also there should be information on a hedging strategy to deal with price developments and also with off times, for example. And same as for the electricity sourcing, such LOI needs to cover 60% of the total expected production. Also for the technical side, you will need a pre-contract with a supplier of the electrolyzer, which also needs to contain certain information like the type of technology, the expected delivery date, and also the price. You need to show that it's expected that you will get the permit to actually construct the production site within the period of 5 years until entry into operation. The Commission requests evidence of a procedure with the relevant authority having been initiated. It's not 100% clear what means initiated. So if you need to actually have filed the application for the permit, or if it also would be possible to only have filed the application for a partial permit where this is possible under national law. In the FAQ, the Commission has dealt with that, but it remained a bit vague. They say the submitted documents must establish in a credible manner that the process of obtaining a permit has been initiated and that the timeline of achieving the permit is realistic. The documentation provided will be assessed considering the national context, which you can also describe in your application. So, as I understand it, it will be important to show that the steps taken are actually expected to lead to the required permit to be granted within the 5-year period. The more you can show, the better. And it will be relevant to explain how this works under national law to make sure that the Commission understands correctly what you have done. Similar for grid connection, you need to show that you have taken initial steps to get a grid connection in case the project intends to use electricity from the grid. And you need to show the technical maturity of the project. You need a project description. You also need a timetable of certain milestones, what is going to happen when. Then you also need to show that you have an experienced team that will deal with the project. And as an exception, it may be possible to show how you expect to get the team that will have the required experience. But as said, this is a pass-fail test. So if the commission is not convinced, there's a risk that they won't accept the project. And last not least, a completion guarantee will be required. In the bid stage, you only need a letter of intent from a bank or financial institution regarding this security. And the security then needs to be provided at a later stage. Can I get the next slide, please? So the security is meant to ensure that the project will actually enter into operation within 5 years. Otherwise, the grant agreement would be terminated and there would be a penalty payment secured by the bank guarantee, which would be 4% of the maximum grant amount for the project. So depending on how much funding you request, can be quite a bit of money. Then other obligations of the producer, there need to be annual reports on progress before entry into operation, and there also need to be reports after entry into operation. Payments will be made twice a year, and correspondingly reports will be required twice a year to show that the project actually meets the requirements. If actually the project does not produce or only produces small amounts of hydrogen, there's the risk that the agreement will be terminated and the grant will be reduced. The threshold is if the project falls below 30% of the expected annual production over a rolling 3-year period. So if something goes wrong just in 1 year, you won't lose the funding. But if the project simply doesn't work, then there would be an end to the subsidies. And also, it will be required that a certification is provided that the 70% of greenhouse gas savings are actually achieved. This will be certified by appropriate third-party certification company. And finally, there will be publications following the award. For the successful applicants that will obtain funding, their name will be published, the relevant hydrogen volume, the bid price as well. And the Commission also intends to at least publish aggregated offtake prices for information. And also information on non-successful applicants will be published, but anonymously, so no one will see that you participated and were not successful. So this was an overview of the pilot auction. I hope I have not forgotten anything important. And I will be happy to take questions at the end of our webinar. But now I would like to hand over to my colleague Britta for insights on contracts, climate protection agreements.
Many thanks, Christine. Welcome, everyone, and good morning. I have the pleasure to talk about climate protection agreements to you today. And yeah, we'll just dive into it and start with the first slide. Okay. Before we actually talk about the climate protection agreements, we need to discuss where we come from, what the background is. And that's basically European climate law, which sets the goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in an amount of 55% and to become climate neutral by 2050. The German Federal Climate Protection Act is even a bit stricter and says that we want to have a reduction of 65% by 2030 and 88% by 2040. And we want to be climate neutral even 5 years earlier in 2045. That's all compared to the 1990 levels. And as we all know, there's still quite a way ahead of us that we need to go to achieve these goals. And yeah, next slide, please. And that takes us to where the problems are. And that is that the costs of climate change are not yet fully priced into the production costs worldwide, which basically leads to a situation where a climate damaging production process is often cheaper for companies than a climate friendly production process, which then means that if you would produce in a climate friendly way with higher costs, you would have a disadvantage in competition compared to others that use conventional production processes. Therefore, investments in climate-friendly production processes are risky because you don't know how you will manage in competition with higher prices. And that's why we need to, or why the government needs to do something about it to sort of give it a push. And that takes us to the next slide, please. Yeah. In order to change that, the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Protection has published its draft guideline on the promotion of climate neutral production processes in industry through so-called climate protection agreements. We'll call that funding guidelines from now on. Do not use that long title every single time. The funding guidelines want to change the situation by way of conclusion of so-called climate protection agreements between the state, the government, with energy-intensive industrial companies, and it's supposed to promote climate-friendly production processes. Next slide, please. Well, under these climate protection agreements, the energy-intensive market participants shall be subsidized with the difference between the cost of a product that is produced with zero or with low emissions compared to the same product that is produced using conventional and emission-intensive processes. Therefore, climate protection agreements are an instrument of state investment steering, which should basically compensate the companies, the energy-intensive companies, from the higher costs that they would have if they use climate-friendly production processes. Next slide, please. Okay, the funding guidelines have two major aims. One is the development of green lead markets, which means that we want to have a significant reduction in emissions by the subsidized industry. It's expected that we're saving around 350 megatons of greenhouse gas equivalents by 2045. And taking into account that about 1/5 of the emissions come from the industry, that's a relative significant goal. Another goal that we're aiming at under the topic development of green lead markets is that we want to give, or that the guidelines want to give an incentive for the necessary technologies and infrastructures, in particular also in hydrogen, that they are developed and implemented in Germany. So we sort of want to go ahead in the market, and innovations shall be triggered to be promoted in Germany, and that should have an effect on decarbonization in product production worldwide. So that's one part of the funding guidelines aims. The other one is the startup funding. Climate protection agreements serve as startup funding for the industry to put in place the transformation process. What it does not do is it's not the financing of the whole project. It's just the startup funding. It shall drive expansion in the hydrogen infrastructure in Germany, which we're promoting also in our national hydrogen strategy. And it should make new technologies marketable so that ultimately risks and costs become more predictable, which eventually also helps the financing of these transformation processes. Next slide, please. The funding guidelines state that only those industrial activities are promoted whose products provide an equivalent or better functionality compared to products of the corresponding reference system, which basically means that we need to know what the greenhouse gas emissions in the production process using conventional plants would be. They are sort of shown in the reference system. The funding guidelines only allow for a conclusion of climate protection agreements with eligible industries, which are listed not in the funding guidelines, but the funding guidelines refer to EU law where they are listed. And these mainly cover energy intensive industries such as glass, ceramics, basic materials, cement, lime, and steel. And that is something that we need to keep in mind and see that it's only for these types of energy intensive participants in the market. Next slide, please. So companies who aim to set up a climate friendly industrial plant and belong to an energy intensive industrial sector, as just described, can set up a production process with 90% less emissions than a comparable traditional or conventional plant, and that would emit 10 kilotons CO2 equivalent per year. Using conventional technologies are basically eligible to profit from climate protection agreements. Next slide, please. Yeah, then the funding guidelines set out the rules on how the climate protection agreements are awarded. Applicants can be municipalities, municipal enterprises, municipal companies, municipal special purpose associations, and any kinds of other companies, as long as they fall into that exhaustive list of companies that can benefit. It's also possible to apply as a consortium if both companies or if the consortium jointly manufactures the products that are eligible under the funding scheme. Then the applicants take part in a bidding process, which eventually ends with the issuance of a grant notice, in German a Zuwendungsbescheid, and the conclusion of a climate protection agreement between the state and the respective applicant. Next slide, please. As far as we're informed so far, it's planned to have 5 bidding procedures, whereas 1 bidding procedure shall take place at the end of 2023, and 2 bidding procedures shall take place in each of 2024 and 25. Please also note that the ministry has already started a 2-month preparatory procedure that started on June 6. The deadline for the preparatory procedures was on 7th August 23, and only companies that took part in the preparatory procedure can profit in the first round of awarding climate protection agreements. If a company hasn't participated, then they can't participate in the first round of bidding procedures. Next slide, please. Climate protection agreements shall have a contract term of 15 years, which begins with the operational start of the project, but in principle no later than 36 months after the funding decision becomes final. However, the funding authority may change the length of this period, but only to a maximum of 48 months. If the green product has become price setting, the climate protection agreement can be terminated prematurely, but also only under certain circumstances that are set out in the funding guidelines. I'm not going into that in too much detail because then we get lost. But yeah, just to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Yeah, then we'll look at the requirements that need to be fulfilled in accordance with 4.12 of the funding guidelines. The project must have a minimum size, as I said earlier, of 10 kilotons CO2 equivalent per year of the absolute average annual greenhouse gas emissions in the reference system. So it's compared to the production processes using conventional procedures. The project is compatible with climate protection goals of the Federal Republic in Germany if at the latest from the beginning of the third year after the operational start, the relative greenhouse gas emission reduction is at least 60% compared to the reference system, a relative greenhouse gas emission reduction of at least 90% compared to the reference system must be technically possible, and the project has a total funding amount of at least 15 million. The thresholds can be set a bit differently in the funding call that the ministry will start ahead of each awarding procedure. Please also note that projects are not eligible for climate protection agreements that would be carried out anyway, because then there's no need to support that project. Next slide, please. As you might have noticed, the funding guidelines not only promote hydrogen, but hydrogen is a big part of it. And as we're talking about hydrogen today, we'll put a bigger focus on that. And in regard to hydrogen, please note that green or blue hydrogen are eligible, and that in relation to green hydrogen, the authority may specify in the funding call the locations of an electrolyser with a capacity of more than 10 megawatts. Also, as an alternative to green or blue hydrogen, hydrogen derivatives can be used if they are equivalent to green or blue hydrogen in terms of contribution to climate protection. Yeah. Next slide, please. How does it work? We'll get to the calculation now. Everyone wants to know what they get under the climate protection agreements, at least the companies that are eligible, maybe also the banks that would finance these projects want to know how it works. The basis is the bid price that is offered by the applicant, the so-called base price, which reflects the additional cost for a climate-friendly production compared to the emission-intensive conventional production. The price is calculated in euros per avoided ton of CO2 equivalent. the avoided greenhouse gas emissions are determined from the difference between the remaining emissions of the project. As I said earlier, it's not just zero emission projects, but also low emission projects, and the emissions of the reference that are shown in the reference system established for a project producing in or under conventional production processes. Next slide, please. This shows again, as an example, how the price setting works. We see the traditional plant, the emission intensive one that has you see that here, the dark green costs for manufacturing and the greenhouse gas emission costs. And then in comparison to that, we here see in the green block, we see the production costs for the climate friendly product and the additional hydrogen costs. And then we see the funding, the payment that covers the higher costs between the traditional plant and the climate friendly plant. Next slide, please. Okay, just to make that very clear, we brought an example to that. Let's say in company X uses a conventional technology to produce its products, and it has production costs of €7 plus an emission certificate costs €3. The total cost of the product is €10. Then when we see the greenhouse gas neutral technology that is used by company Y, for example, that has a total cost of €12, so that's €2 more expensive than the traditional way of production, and therefore the climate protection agreements have a dynamic price, which means that when the emission certificate costs increase in the future, the funding size will get smaller, because in comparison of both costs, the gap is not as big anymore, which could eventually lead to, or it's supposed to lead to, a situation where the green climate neutral product has become price setting in the market. And once that has taken place and the emission neutral product production is even cheaper than the conventional production, the applicant that has been awarded with a climate protection agreement needs to pay back the gap that it now gets between the base price that was set and the new price that's set on the market. The next slide visualizes that again. Here, the green part of it, that is where we see the funding, and just here where the green and the blue line cross, we see that the market price changes, and the dark blue price would then the price that has to be paid back under the climate protection agreement. And yeah, that leads me to the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions and hand over back to Max.
Thank you, Britta, and also thank you, Christina, for these very interesting presentations. Yeah, I open the floor to any questions which you may have, and indeed we already have some questions which were raised by the audience. And I think, Christine, the first one might be one for you, which is making reference to the completion guarantee. And the question reads, you made reference to a bank guarantee. Can you clarify who shall provide such completion guarantee? Isn't that the sponsor developer?
Yes, if you see it that way, it's the sponsor developer that needs to provide a guarantee. However, the guarantee must be issued by a bank or by a financial institution that has a minimum rating as specified by the EU Commission, which means you need to find a bank that is willing to guarantee this obligation. And you will need to submit a letter of intent of that bank or other financial institution with the bid. And the Commission will publish a form for such letter of intent that must be used to provide to the EU Commission.
Thank you. Another question was raised, and Britta, maybe this one is for you. Does the climate protection agreement only apply to green H2 and not other green fuels like synthetic LNG or biomethane?
Yes, yes, I'm happy to answer that. No, it doesn't only apply to green hydrogen. It also applies to other green fuels. But as we're talking about hydrogen today in our webinar, we focused on the hydrogen part of it. But it's not only hydrogen that is promoted by that. There's a very long, I don't know if you can see that, I can show that to you. There's a very long list of Q&A published by the ministry. It's like 260 questions that in much detail sort of answer questions, what other things would be eligible. Yeah, but that should be the answer for that. I can't go into all the details, obviously, but yes, it's not just green hydrogen.
Brilliant. The questions keep rolling in, and that's great. So I think another one for you, Christine, was raised. Could you please clarify what is expected in respect of the hedging strategy for the H2 offtake? There is currently no liquid price benchmark for hydrogen.
Yes, that's an interesting question. The EU Commission does not give too much detail on this point. From what they say in their terms and conditions, it sounds to me that they do not necessarily expect a real hedging agreement or something like that. Rather, they say the project must show that it has considered hedges against, on the one hand, changes in the electricity prices, electricity supply, and on the other hand, changes on the offtake side, which would include mitigation of the risk of production stops or schedule alterations of production due to unforeseen revenue decreases or cost increases. So it's as I understand it, they more expect you to have a robust business model and to be able to show what will happen if you can't produce as expected, and also regarding electricity prices, that you are sure that or reasonably sure that your project will be viable over the expected time of operation. And of course, if it's possible to conclude a hedging agreement, that might be good to have. But as it sounds, it might also be possible to show other aspects on how you are intending to deal with this. Maybe in this context, as the EU Commission, I mean, they will publish the relevant forms and possibly more information when they open the tender end of November. Also, there is a possibility to ask questions directly to the EU Commission. They've published an email address where questions can be sent. And they have said they plan to have an information day shortly after opening the auction, so likely late November. I've not yet seen a precise date, But this is also something to keep in mind for those who are seriously interested in this auction round. I guess it would be very helpful to participate in that and see where the Commission would provide further detail.
Thank you, Christine. So another question was raised with which activity, and I would add, if any, can a municipality take part in the CCFDs?
Yeah, that regards the climate protection agreements. CCFD is contracts for difference, which is also a term used just for everyone who might not know that. Obviously, that's a very good question, because I personally was wondering about it, why it's set out in that way, because usually municipalities are not part of the energy intensive industrial industries, which are eligible for application. So my answer is that I see very limited scope for municipalities to actually profit from climate protection agreements.
And maybe to add on that, the idea of the entire climate protection system is to bring the industry to a level where it can act and benefit. And I've actually been in discussions with quite a few municipal companies who, of course, are very interested, and the interest in itself is certainly not bad, but certainly the aim here is to be taken into account, and the aim is clearly to get into industry players into the market and not municipalities. Another question referred to the funding system and other auctions and funding systems to be available, and that was, how does the EEG 2023 systems for green hydrogen like 39O and 39P complement the EU pilot auction? Of course, we cannot answer specific questions, but we're very, very happy for you, Christine, to at least briefly say something around that. How is this falling into other funding systems?
Yes, this is a separate auction where the money comes directly from the EU, and the same project might also be eligible under certain national funding systems, be it under the German EEG or under systems in other countries. However, it's important to note that there can be no cumulation of subsidies. So a project that obtains funding under a national subsidy system will not be eligible to obtain money under this EU pilot auction, and likely also the other way around, because this principle of non-cumulation is a general principle of EU state aid law, and so the project can have a choice of where to apply for funding if several opportunities are open, but most likely it will not be possible to combine those.
Thank you. Then there was also questions whether the climate protection agreements would also be applicable on the use of green instead of gray hydrogen. Britta, maybe this is something you can answer.
Yeah, it's applicable to green and blue hydrogen. So and not to gray hydrogen, because in what we're aiming is to a transformation process where we don't have any climate damaging products in the line. That is why it's limited to green and blue hydrogen and does not include gray hydrogen.
Yeah. Christine, back to you, because there was another question, and that one is quite that one is also one we are hearing quite often. So happy to bring this to the broader audience. So no accumulation of subsidies, even if we build the electrolyzer plus wind turbines or PV. What is your view on that?
Lawyer's answer, it's complicated. The Commission has published quite a bit of detail about what can and what cannot be combined in terms of subsidy. So it's worth really looking closely. And for example, for renewable energy installations, it depends on when the hydrogen plant will enter into operation, whether or not there can be subsidies related to the green electricity to be used. And it may be possible that subsidies are permitted, but it's important at this point to really be careful and to look closely on what the Commission said and the relevant regulations to make sure that there is no bug in the concept which kicks the project out of the eligibility for the auction.
And that's something which I would like to emphasize on, really, because what we see quite a lot now is project teasers which are heavily based on the accumulation of subsidies, and these are be taken for granted, and obviously in at least some of these projects, which is the majority, the accumulation has not really been thought through. So we have quite a few project teasers where quite obviously the subsidies which were included in the financial models weren't cumulatable. So this is something to take quite a close look on rather early on. Another question, I think it's the final one, Britta, for you. Do CPAs only apply to greenfield facilities or to existing facilities being fitted with CCS equipment? CCS, carbon capture and storage, for those of you who are not familiar with the terms.
Well, I understand the question in the way that you want to know whether I need to put something up from the start newly, and only that could be eligible under the funding guidelines to be awarded with a climate protection agreement. No, I don't think it's just greenfield facilities. It's also existing facilities, because the funding guidelines look at transforming climate damaging production processes into climate friendly production processes. So it's existing facilities that are changed, that are transformed to a climate neutral way that can be awarded to.
Thank you very much. Well, let me summarize this, and then first of all, please join me in thanking both you, Britta, and both you, Christine. Thank very, very much for taking the time and preparing these very interesting presentations today, and for giving us an insight. I would like to thank also the audience for raising the questions and to make this quite a lively discussion. Later today, you will receive a follow-up email which will include the slides, so the slides will be shared, some relevant materials, and a short feedback survey. I already mentioned it, but please, your feedback is very important to us to ensure we're delivering the events that are relevant and engaging. If you could find just 2 or 3 minutes to complete it, that would be highly appreciated. So thank you very much again, and hope you have a good rest of the day, and see you around in the hydrogen sector soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.